It's time to hit the ice, Penguin fans.
Chris Mack has you covered
With all the news and notes surrounding your Penguin. Only on
Fifth Avenue Faceoff.
It is Fifth Avenue Faceoff. I am Chris Mack. He is Erik Tangradi. Joins me a couple times every week. And those are the Pittsburgh Penguins who we talk about on a roll. I mean, relatively speaking for them, 3 in a row, the first 3-game or longer winning streak they've had since before Christmas, since mid-December, as they beat the Predators down in Nashville, the first of a 3-game swing through the Deep South. Nashville, then Tampa, and we'll talk to Erik Erlendsson of LightningInsider.com later, and then on to Florida to face the Panthers. First week of this big 3-week stretch we talked about a couple days ago, and the trade deadline, of course, as we speak right now, about 48 hours away. David Pagnotta of the Fourth Period will join me later to break down where exactly the Penguins are shopping and what they may have to give up to get what they want. But let's talk about the Predators game specifically, Tango. And how are you, first of all? It's another beautiful day in Western PA. Starting to make it feel like playoff time when the weather gets this nice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like there's something to in that feeling as a player. It's like the groundhog, right? He comes out as a hockey player,
Right.
you know, you go through those winter funk and then the sunshine and it gets a little bit warmer and you get those playoff jitters a little bit early. So it's awesome.
So let's talk about what I thought was a 3 or 4 pronged takeaway for me from the win in Nashville. And I'll start with what has been the constant this year for this team is the top 6 continues to produce. And I'll work backwards, and you give me your feedback on each one of the 3 goals scored last night. Let's start with Brian Rust's empty netter. Just a ridiculous individual effort, and exactly what this guy does. You know, when they made their runs to the cup, he was more of a depth middle 6 guy. But he's become a guy that they need to count on to come up big, and he's had his ups and downs this year. Some people have banged on him because of the contract extension, but for me, he's still a guy that does exactly what you want from a middle 6, which is grinds when he has to, skates and shows off a little bit when he has to, and that empty net goal was just a perfect example of what he can do when the individual effort is on display.
Yes, absolutely. And what's intangible about Brian Rust is like you use the word, he's a gamer, right? So sometimes on the score sheet, when he's playing his best hockey, and so in years past, it was who's going to block a shot in the third period, who's going to make a wall play, take a hit. In this situation, like games on the line, individual effort. It's not just a score sheet empty netter. It's like that is Brian Rust, big time hockey that we all know and why there's so much value in him. I think the struggles, like we talked about the contract, maybe like his success in years past came from being a straightforward, in your face, north-south type of hockey player.
Right.
Whether coming into this year, you know, making top $6 now, does that change the way his mindset is and the way he needs to play? Who knows? But that to me is hope of that's the type of guy. That's your you know, at this point he's not the dark horse anymore, but you know, the Brian Rust playoff hockey type guys is what they need churning going down the stretch.
So if we continue our analysis goal by goal, working backwards, which is kind of how I want to look at it, the one that was most impressive to me was probably the Zucker goal, the eventual game-winning goal. And there was even 3 prongs to this thing, in that you had great effort from Rickard Rakell as the F1, the first forward into the zone, really pushing hard on the forecheck, not physically necessarily pushing hard on the forecheck, but just chasing the puck down, chasing the play down, and forcing the Predators into a mistake. Evgeny Malkin supports him first along the wall, then below the goal line. Jason Zucker reads the whole thing, sees 3 Preds at or below the goal line and 2 of his teammates there, and kind of sits back in that soft spot at the bottom of the circle there. And the puck comes his way, and he does what Jason Zucker has done all year, which is just make an instinctive play. The kind of stuff that was tough for him, I think, when he was less than 100% the first couple of years with this team. He's done it all year, man, and he just comes up huge again last night.
Yeah, it's a big goal, and it kind of gave me the glimpses of the game. Was it a Game 6 or Game 7 Stanley Cup goal? Was it Hornquist?
Yes.
Yeah, you know, like that late in the game. But no, I think that all
same
stems
end of the
from
rink too. I think.
yeah, that all stems to me from confidence. I mean, if we're looking at this team a week ago, I'm wondering if they're in like a passive 1-2-2 and they're just like, let's get this point and let's go to overtime. But now that we're thinking, now they're thinking big picture, they got some confidence under their belt. Like, talk about the pursuit, the puck pursuit with a minute and whatever time left in the third period. Like,
Right.
a lot of teams who aren't the real deal just concede that and let's make sure we have two guys high and let's go to overtime. Like, that was super impressive. Again, we talk about the playoff pedigree being hard for 60 minutes of the game and knowing if you can trust in that process that you're going to have a positive outcome. So yeah, to me, that was like everything you want to see from that line, right? You got Raquel doesn't need to be super finish checks and blow people up into the glass, but use your speed to create disruption. Gino always finding ways to find pucks in scrums, and then Zucker, like you said, the confidence. When you have that type of confidence, you have poise in the scoring areas. When you're gripping your stick heavy, maybe you're just too quick to get in and support the puck versus trusting that they're going to get you the puck in a soft area. So overall, I mean, that was an awesome hockey goal. But to me, it was more impressive that the team actually believed we're going to play the right way for 60 minutes and not just concede to getting a point in overtime.
And the one that got them started, the one that tied the game up at one apiece late, obviously Sid. It's Sid being Sid, and you mentioned it. I want to say a week or two ago. As long as Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin are on this team, and they're simply doing what they do, it's impossible to count this team out. And that's that's what loops back on this whole thing about the top six just continuing to produce. As long as they're doing that, yeah, we can talk about the struggles in other parts of the roster, and they're very valid. But Sidney Crosby's still out there doing Sidney Crosby type things.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, every year it's almost like not that you want to doubt him or the writers or the people want to doubt him, but like his age. I mean, is this guy ever going to age? Is he ever going to slow
Right.
down? Like, you hear so many times, and knock on wood, but like some guys have these late lingering injuries that just can't have them play at a high level. Like 50% of Sidney Crosby is still the best player on the Penguins, but we're getting like big time, big game Sid right now, and even Gino coming off of a knee injury, and Tanger, like it's just super impressive to see. And as critical as you want to be on management, a lot of times these conversations are like being critical on your big three, but all they've done has been consistent and produce, and that's been amazing.
Well, I mean, you see it even in the example of a guy we saw play a couple nights ago, and a guy we'll see again on Thursday, and that's Corey Perry. He's a couple of years older than Sid, but Corey Perry at one point was Hart Trophy candidate, Conn Smythe Trophy kind of guy, and now he's a fourth liner in Tampa. Sid is only a couple of years younger, and he just keeps rolling. And the most impressive part of that first goal, the Crosby goal, and it feeds into the next prong of what I was impressed with against the Predators, was what Brock McGinn did. Brock McGinn finds out in the midst of the dad's trip, right? They're in Nashville. It's supposed to be a fun trip down south. And Brock McGinn finds out he's been placed on waivers. Still in the lineup, though, because we only got so many bodies, Brock. So you're going to play. And he plays his ass off. He's blocking shots. He's dragging himself to the bench afterwards. And then he sets up the Crosby goal there. And, it's indicative for me of, we can talk about the bottom six as a whole, but it's indicative for me that something may be clicking. Something may be fun. When you're trying to turn the ignition over on a cold morning on your car, and something's happening with Carter, McGinn, and Heinen now. At least you hope anyway, because that's the kind of thing. I don't know if a lot of guys react that way, getting thrown on waivers and then a couple hours later playing the kind of game that Brock McGinn played.
Yeah, it was super impressive, and I think it speaks highly of his character for somebody who's probably been scrutinized. Of look at the cards he was dealt, and look at the way he was resilient and persevered through. And I think that he definitely gained a lot of the respect back of the city, which he probably doesn't quite care about. But I think more importantly, his teammates. To me, it was so great to see that, and it's been great to see that the way that the bottom six has been acting or reacting to things.
Right.
But I think that's what makes the Kapanen move so good for this team. We talk all the time about they just need some sort of inner competition or something to make them aware that like the status quo is not going to be good enough moving forward. And I think just him moving on may have given that bottom six this feeling of, okay, maybe our job security is on the line. And now we're starting to see some of their best hockey. So we had talked about before, like sure, we don't need to see these catastrophic, monumental blockbuster trades, but just some sort of movement to get a spark in that bottom six of saying, like, maybe we don't have the competition from within, but if you guys aren't going to perform, like, here you go. We just moved somebody out of town, regardless of where they were
Right.
making and what they've done. So I think that that's really, really good for the team that kind of have that little spark, and obviously they're responding to it as well.
And just before we started recording this, for full disclosure to those listening, it's about quarter after 2 Eastern on Wednesday afternoon. Just before we started recording this, it was announced that McGinn and Mark Friedman, had cleared waivers. So we'll see what the future is for them. They can be sent now to Wilkes if that's what the Penguins organization should decide to do. We'll see if that is the move that they make. It would save them just a little bit of cap space. Not as much had either of them, especially McGinn, been claimed as Kapanen was. But again, it is indicative to me that something's clicking on those bottom two lines, Eric, in that the fourth line was strong again last night. You know, O'Connor, Bluger, and Archibald were tops on the team in some possession metrics, shot share, Fenwick, Corsi. And the same could be said for the third line. They were best in actually expected goal differential, which is something we haven't seen from the third line all year, which is, again, indicative to me that maybe something's happening there. It doesn't tell me, if I'm Ron Hextall, that, I shouldn't make a move now. What it actually tells me is, if Ron Hextall's learning from mistakes, is that maybe I should have made some of these moves a few weeks earlier so that I would have seen this reaction sooner to give me a better bead on what I actually have, rather than getting this read on this team 48 hours ahead of the deadline.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, if this team, it's crazy how close they are, but yet how far away they are. Like when we talk about the top six, I feel confident the top six can compete with anybody in the Eastern Conference. Then it comes down to the bottom six. You play the Penguins against the Rangers, and you put Sid's line on the ice against that new powerhouse first line that the Rangers have. And if you tell me they play even hockey, Sid's line scores 0 goals and Zibanejad scores 0 goals, that's a win for us in Pittsburgh. Right? Then you go down the line. Malkin line plays against Trocheck, Kreider line, 0 goals. Then that's where things get shaky as far as what type of team are they for real? Because that's where this team needs to separate itself, is in the bottom six. But it has been really good to see them step up and start to play some good hockey. And maybe that the game against Tampa gave them some confidence, some belief back in the way that they need to play. And hopefully that sample size can carry over a little bit further. But yeah, I agree. Is it too late now that we're seeing this chasing standings? Well, I don't know. I think there's still some time, and I think those waiver wire moves are a plan to give them flexibility for something bigger if it's out there.
The one thing that I don't want to say it flew under the radar, because I've seen some people recognize it since the win over the Preds, is that perhaps Tristan Jarry's starting to shake the rust off finally. UC Saros had a really strong game as well until he didn't. Jarry didn't have any of those mental lapses or mistakes that I thought he had in the first couple games back. He looked really solid. He looked like playoff Jarry when we've had the opportunity, good playoff Jarry when we've had the opportunity to see that against the Preds, in that, you know, the Predators had a makeshift lineup put together anyway. So you got the feeling they were just trying to survive it and get through it. But when they did start to put, you know, when Jankowski scores that goal late, it could be very easy for them to start to fold up the tents and say, oh my God, and Jarry maybe looks at it and says, what did I do wrong there? But instead, he stands tall. Jarry outplaying Juicy Saros just a little bit tells me, okay, maybe we're moving in the right direction with him as well.
Yeah, and for me, it's just about his poise. Like you can tell at times with Jarry when he has the spurts, like he gets very quick and it almost looks like an anxious type of goaltending. Where to me, he just looked very relaxed. Nashville is an incredibly difficult environment to go into and play. There's so many distractions. It's kind of like a miniature Vegas, where the hockey game is actually secondary to what's happening in the stands and the crowd, the energy, the emotion. So regardless, I mean, it's still the National Hockey League. Regardless of the roster that Nashville had, I think the St. Louis game was a great way to prepare them for this one, in the sense of you just dominate. You're not getting results. Stick to it. And I think that's where Mike Sullivan, as a coach and as a leader, has really showed in the last few games of this winning streak, of like, let's just trust the process and keep pushing through. good things will happen. And when you're actually right, when you say those things, you wouldn't believe how much confidence it brings to a locker room. Because as a coach, and now that I'm sitting on this side of it a little bit, like,
Right.
please guys, keep trusting me. It's going to happen. Good things. And if it doesn't, it almost sucks the wind out twice as much. But then when it does, it can rally this group together to really start to believe again.
Okay, so I'll just before I let you run, just 2 minutes with Tango here. There's got to be, and you don't have to name names. You know that's my rule. You never have to name names if you don't want to. But there's got to be a good Nashville story in there somewhere, like somebody sleeping in and missing the bus for morning skate, or like there's got to be someone somewhere had to do something crazy on Broadway at some point.
Yeah, I've had a teammate. We had a 2 o'clock game, and usually on a 2 o'clock game, you find out the night before who's playing and who's not playing. In
Mhm.
this situation, I wasn't playing, and a teammate of mine was not playing as well. So we felt like on a Saturday night, it would be good to just go listen to the music on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
So we actually didn't get, it wasn't too bad. We got into bed at a pretty decent hour, and the next morning, a bunch of group chats are going around like, "Hey, is he awake? Because he actually is playing. Someone was sick last night."
Oh no.
So he was then inserted into the lineup in a 2 o'clock game. Didn't wake up till, I banged on his door and told him, like, you got to get it together. And yeah, so Nashville's a really cool place. I mean, if you're a country fan, even if you're not, it's just a unique
Yeah.
place. But I remember having to wake a teammate up who thought he wasn't playing the next day for a 2 o'clock game. After having a couple pops and then listening to
Yeah.
live music.
How'd he play once he got out there?
Unbelievable. Almost to
Of
the point
course.
where
Of course.
no expectations. It's almost like when you go into a round of golf and you tell yourself you stink and you play the best round of your life. You have zero expectations. You're going to keep it as simple as you've ever kept it. All that game, it was impressive. It was a very, very impressive effort. To the point where I think he learned a little bit about his own sports psychology moving forward.
Maybe that's the key for the Pens if they get into the playoffs. Have a night out. Have a night out with
Yeah.
the boys before game one or a big elimination game, and just say, you know what, we're just gonna roll the puck out and see what happens. Good stuff. I appreciate it, Eric. As always, get out and enjoy the nice weather, and we'll catch up again next time. Okay.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Talk soon.
Lots of different things going into the way the Pens have won these last 3 games. The question is, can they keep them all rolling? Because all of them obviously are good signs. The top 6 continuing to stay healthy and produce, knock on wood. The bottom 6 turning things around in the right direction. And Tristan Jarry starting to shake some of the rust off as well. We are less than 48 hours until the trade deadline as you're listening to this, right around 48 hours to the deadline as it's being recorded. So who better to talk to than one of the NHL's leading insiders from thefourthperiod.com, David Pagnotta, next on Fifth Avenue Faceoff. As we're recording this, it's about 48 hours exactly to the NHL trade deadline. Welcome back into Fifth Avenue Faceoff. I'm Chris Mack of the Fan Morning Show, Sports Radio 93.7 The Fan. Lucky enough to be joined by the man from the fourth period, David Pagnotta. David, thanks for taking the time. I know you are absolutely jammed up. I hear the cell phone in the background every 2 minutes. So, again, I appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. No, thank you for having me.
Let's start here. I'm just going to kind of throw out a couple names, the names that people are talking about the most here in Pittsburgh right now.
Yep.
And you tell me, and who knows, something may have happened with these names by the time people hear us talking about it, but let's go with it. Let's start with Jakob Chychrun in Arizona. I know you said there's still definitely a very vibrant market for him, but I don't know if the Pens are still in on it or not.
I think they are. To how engaged, how close they are to a potential finish line on anybody on Chychrun, I don't know yet. I can tell you that as of yesterday, the last update I had on Chychrun with Los Angeles, by the way, was around 2:00 Eastern, where LA still had an offer on the table, and they wanted to know if this was going to happen or not. They weren't getting an answer, so they shifted and moved on and went in a different direction. I don't know if they're 100% out. I suspect they are, but I haven't gotten that definitively yet. But Pittsburgh still in the mix. Carolina very much in the mix. Washington was in the mix as well before they made their trade and got Rasmus Sandin. Are they willing to move their first-round pick that they still own? I think they are. It probably is top 10 or top 12 protected from the sounds of things, but they're still there. Pittsburgh as well, certainly. And then you've got some of the teams that have been jumping in and out of the race. Is it a Buffalo? Is it St. Louis? Is it the Islanders? there are other teams, Calgary, that have been in and out of this race, but they want some finality here. The Coyotes do, and so does Jacob Chikrin. He wants this freaking thing to end. So we're waiting to see kind of how this unfolds. But as far as, like you said, we're recording this around 3:00 Eastern right now. As far as I know, the Penguins are still engaged in those discussions.
And it sounds like, according to your sources, that's probably what led the Kings to pull the trigger on Gavrikov and the Columbus deal.
Yep.
If they were simply sold on, we've got to get left-handed defense in here now. So the other one that definitely has all kinds of smoke around it, and it makes a ton of sense. Go ahead.
I'm going to pause quickly. Dylan Larkin, $8.7 million over 8 years with the Detroit Red Wings. So as this is happening, I'm just confirming that it's 100% done before I put it on the old Twitter box. But
no, that's okay.
I'm going to just get that going now. So see, stuff like this happens.
And that's a huge, I mean, that is, with Detroit and Buffalo at the points where they are in their organizational development, this is what has people in Pittsburgh concerned about the long-term trade-off versus the short-term. All of us want this team and want Ron Hextall to be in on now. It's why you brought the band back, as everybody has said all year. But it's also facing the harsh reality, as the Caps have already decided to face this year, that the long term is still has to be a part of your plan somehow, however minutely in the back of your head, because you're being chased by the Detroits and the Buffaloes of the world. Detroit very much so deciding, yes, we're going to continue to build around Dylan Larkin.
They are, but they're also, because of their situation, losing 2 in a row to the Ottawa Senators on Monday and Tuesday. They're looking around and taking some calls on a number of their players. Tyler Bertuzzi is out there. Oscar Sundqvist is out there. Pius Sutter is out there. They've got some other players that they're listening on with respect to possibly, getting some assets while still looking to improve in the long haul. This is a team that wants to continue to compete for a playoff spot, not just this season, but immediately next year. So you're going to look for them to make some moves here. I've been hearing that they're listening on a number of guys beyond the ones I mentioned. I don't know how realistic they get to that point, but it certainly sounds like they're a little bit open to some suggestions here. And again, Detroit wants to compete next year, but it might be a little situation of too little too late right now this season, which is why they're listening on Sundqvist and Bertuzzi and others.
Well, yeah, I was just going to bring up Bertuzzi. Obviously, the contract up at the end of the year, UFA, recommitting to Dylan Larkin. Perhaps there's not the sense that there's enough cap space to keep them both around long term. I would imagine, to your point, that'll get Bertuzzi's name back out on the market. That wasn't a name I was going to mention. That's not the spot with all the smoke, so there must be fire. That's out in the Pacific Northwest, where because of the overlap between the two organizations, so many people here in Pittsburgh are now looking to Vancouver and saying, okay, not only is there overlap between the organizations, but you've also got weapons that either make sense or can make sense. Ron Hextall saying, I'm not trading draft picks, high-end draft picks, unless I'm getting guys with term. And that's what leads you down the path of Brock Besser. He's the first one that pops to mind. And of course, JT Miller comes up as well, but that cap hit is just enormous. And JT really hasn't played as well this year until the last couple of weeks. What are you hearing about what's going on in Vancouver?
And he wants to stay at the center position as well. That's another big component in this. And if it's a center position in Pittsburgh, it's a 3C slot. And I don't know if that makes a lot of sense if I'm the Penguins, to be perfectly honest, unless he's totally comfortable playing on the left side of either Gino or Sid, which nice spot to be in. But I don't know. I know they've had discussions. I just don't know how serious those have really gotten, to be perfectly honest. I know, and I've confirmed this directly, that Brock Besser has been part of discussions as well. And this has been going on for several weeks. Whether they get to the finish line or not, we got 48 hours to see. But definitely, without question, they've had discussions about Brock Besser. There would have to be money retained. Even if a contract is going back, there's likely to be money retained from Vancouver's side of things, and whether it's Pittsburgh or another team, because they're talking to a few others. But things have really, really heated up, and Vancouver's doing a lot of things right now to pour water on these types of flames. But they're very much engaged in serious discussions with Pittsburgh and a couple other teams on Brock Besser. So this is something I'm trying to monitor. I got a message right before I came on to keep my head on a swivel here. So we could see something happen now or or a little bit later with respect to the Canucks in terms of another move coming. Does it include the Penguins? It's possible. I can tell you with full certainty they've had those discussions.
Who else are you hearing aside from those names that we've all had bouncing around here in Pittsburgh over the last couple of days that the Penguins and Ron Hextall may be in on?
Well, it sounds like based on the fact that you've got names like Besser, Miller, Chychrun, it looks like without question it's guys with term. I think Hextall, like a few other teams, like Edmonton, for example, they've made their big move with Ekholm, but they're still kind of combing through things, lurking through the weeds, so to speak, to see if prices drop on guys. And I think that's where Pittsburgh is to a certain degree. If they can bring in, some extra firepower, and it costs less now than it did before a couple of weeks ago, even a couple of days ago, then I think that's where they'd like to go in terms of depth and complementary pieces. But in terms of key acquisitions, major acquisitions that include giving up a first round pick and some quality assets, it sounds like you're looking at guys with term. And, there are pieces that are out there that are available if you want to pay a premium for them. Like Josh Anderson in Montreal, for example. Like that's a kind of player that has term, power forward type that the Canadians are willing to listen on, but it's a hefty price. Have the Penguins engaged in serious discussions there? I'm not totally sure, to be honest, but that's the kind of player that I can see them looking at. A guy with term like Besser and so on, a guy with term that can slot into a top six. The other thing I'm very curious about is the goaltending.
Right.
I know they'd like to shore it up, but I don't know if it's a Cam Talbot type or if they're looking to go big fish hunting. Is it Demko in Vancouver? Is that where all these talks are going and we're being misdirected? Is it John Gibson in Anaheim, the local boy? Are we going to look at that? He's available. That's a serious type of trade, and that's something, even with Demko, that is likely to happen in the summer. But I'm curious to see what they do with their goaltending position. Now with Korpisalo in LA, I mean, there's Quick
Right.
as well, but I'm hearing some stuff on Vegas there and Toronto more so than Pittsburgh. But I mean, we'll see. I'm very curious as to see what they do in goal as much as what they're trying to do with the rest of the roster.
Yeah, as much as they need it now, like you said, because of the cap hits involved, I wonder if the goaltending issue is something Ron Hextall will save for the summer, especially if
Right.
you're talking about names like Demko, who's dealt with injury, and Johnny Whitehall, John Gibson, who has a big cap hit for them to try and shuffle into the middle of the deck. All that being said, David, who are some of the names? Obviously, we know Hextall is going to have to deal high-end draft picks if he wants to get something big done. Who are the names that other teams are targeting? We've heard Pettersson. We've heard P.O. Joseph. Who else is a target out there?
Honestly, it depends on what kind of transpires here. So from a Penguins perspective, if you're bringing in, let's say it is a top six winger, whoever it may be, let's say it's a top six winger, does that then lead a guy like Jason Zucker to become available? And if you're a team that's a contending team out west, for example, because you're probably not going to want to do too much in your own division, is that an option? So we'll see what happens here with respect to other potential guys moving out. But if they bring in somebody that has term within their top six, then you look to a guy like Zucker with minimal term on that deal. I think this is his final year. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
so yeah, so maybe is it a Vegas? Is it a Seattle type? And then you get him out west for teams that have cap space that are willing to do some things. You freed up a little bit with McGinn and Friedman clearing waivers. Can you create a little bit of additional space by moving a guy like Zucker out if it means replacing him with a guy with term? I think in terms of teams looking at Pittsburgh's assets, I think it's more aligned with them bringing somebody in and resulting in somebody leaving. I think it's going to be a give and go type thing if we're talking about impact additions.
One final thing before I let you run. What is the future for Ron Hextall here in Pittsburgh? As you're hearing things around the league, is he secure here? Does he have to reach a certain mile marker by the end of the season? And who ultimately, we don't even know here in Pittsburgh, to be quite honest, because the Fenway Sports Group has remained somewhat shadowy as far as their influence on things. Who's ultimately going to call Ron Hextall on the carpet if it doesn't go as expected down the stretch?
Well, it kind of starts with Berkey in terms of the pecking order. I mean, I think they would go to him and say, "Hey, we lost in the first round. We missed the playoffs. We lost in the second round. Whatever ends up happening here, if it doesn't get to a point in which ownership is content, not only with the success either way this season, but with the game plan for next season, I think it goes to Berkey. And you go to Brian and you say, okay, here's where we're at. Explain the situation, and we'll tell you whether we accept it or not, and then go from there. I haven't gotten much of a sense that either him or Hextall are in, dire straits. But again, I think it's going to come down to how this team finishes this season. Is it outside of the playoffs? That's not good. If it's inside the playoffs, is it a 7-game series and a heartbreaker in the first round? You can make arguments that, hey, this could have gone either way. We can keep building off this. The one thing that I have seen in this last week is the fact that he's owning up to some of the mistakes that have been made. He talked about Kapanen. It didn't work out. We thought he would be able to get it going. Didn't work out. We moved on. Got lucky, but we moved on. And the same with McGinn. It's not working out. He's got 2 more years on that deal. We'll free up some cap space now and then figure it out in the offseason how we want to approach it. The fact that he's owning up, that takes a lot, especially in the NHL. GMs don't like doing that very much. And the fact that he's doing it, I think, is an important sign. But really, it's going to come down to how this team finishes this season.
David, thanks so much for the time. Like I said, I know you're absolutely slammed in the last 48 hours of the trade deadline process, so we appreciate you taking the time. Follow him on Twitter at @the4thperiod. Of course, the4thperiod.com. David Pagnotta. Thanks again, man. We really appreciate it.
You got it. Take care.
How about it? A little slice of breaking news. It's not breaking anymore because you're listening to the podcast later after we recorded it, but Dylan Larkin re-upping for a long term and plenty of money in Detroit. And it sounds like the Pens are still in on all those big names that we've been hearing about over the last couple of days. We'll see how it shakes down. Thanks again to David Pagnotta of the Fourth Period for joining. We take a look at Thursday's opponent, a team that for some reason the Penguins have been able to handle this season. Why do they seem to have the Bolts number? We talked to Erik Erlendsson of LightningInsider.com as the Pens get ready for Tampa as a part of this Southern Road swing. That next on Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Welcome back in Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Pens, first 3-game winning streak since way back before Christmas. And a part of it was a huge win over the Tampa Bay Lightning at home the other night. But now it's on to Tampa. The Southern Road trip got started on a good note in Nashville, but it's on to face the Lightning and the Panthers in the state of Florida. And here to give us a little, maybe answer some questions about what's going on with the Lightning, Erik Erlendsson of LightningInsider.com. Erik, first of all, thanks for taking the time and doing this. How are you?
I'm good. I'm enjoying the lovely weather. I love to make people up north a little jealous this time of year when I tell them it's about 84 degrees outside.
You know what? It's almost 70 here in Western Pennsylvania
today.
So
that's like summer.
Yes, we're getting a little slice of spring a little early. So let's talk about why the Pens seem to have the Bolts number this year. There was a game very early, beginning of the season, when the Pens had pretty good jump, looked like the Penguins we expected the Penguins to be this year. Not the team that we got for the last, I want to say, 6 to 8 weeks. And then all of a sudden, the Lightning come to town this past weekend, and the Penguins start to look like the Penguins again. The bottom 6 looks like they're actually capable of doing something. The Stars do what they've done all year in Crosby and Malkin, and they score. But what is it about? This is, I hesitate to call it a rivalry because they don't play enough to make it a rivalry. But going all the way back to the Eastern Conference Final Series several years ago, the Lightning seem to draw the best out of the Pens more often than not.
Probably because of the star power on the other side, right? Like stars like to rise against stars, and
Sure.
Stamkos and Kucherov and Point and Hedman and specifically Vasilevsky. I know Brian Elliott started the game on Sunday, but yeah, there's stars on the other side, and that usually tends to get top players to kind of raise their level because they know if they don't play to their level, then the other team's top players could have the potential to do something. And and look, in both of those meetings earlier this year, the Penguins did catch the Lightning on the second half of back-to-backs. It's not an excuse, but it is reality, right? And the Lightning to start the year, I think that was game 3 of the year for Tampa Bay, started a 3-game road trip. They were atrocious in the first couple of weeks of the season. They looked like a team that had been to 3 straight Stanley Cup finals and were tired. And so the Pens caught them at good times. The game on Sunday, the Lightning actually had the lead after the first period and then just completely fell asleep, right? They forgot Evgeny Malkin was the guy coming out of the penalty box there at the end of that penalty. And of course, he's going to score on a breakaway. It seems like Malkin does that to Tampa Bay every year, no matter who's on the ice against them. And then, I mean, geez, 5 goals in the span of 4 minutes and 55 seconds. I mean, talk about completely falling apart. I'll be interested really to see how Tampa Bay responds, because they didn't play very well against Florida. You know, they're in the middle of this stretch of games against Buffalo twice and Pittsburgh twice, and they've got Florida. They get Carolina next weekend as well coming up. So they've got some opponents who are desperate for points here, and the Lightning have not played like they're desperate for anything, right? And they sagged last night against Florida. The Panthers scored a goal 4 minutes in or 6 minutes in, and the Lightning didn't have a shot on goal the rest of the period. I've never seen this team during this stretch of success that they've had sag the way they did in that game against Florida, and they didn't wake up till the third period. And by then, you know, you're down 3-1, and you just can't come back to even putting 19 shots on goal against Sergei Bobrovsky.
Well, I think there's a valuable question there, Eric, about what are the Lightning playing for at this point. I mean, you could argue they're playing for home ice advantage in a series against the Leafs, right? But that's about all that's on the table. Those two seem destined to meet each other in the first round because of the current playoff format. And without opening that can of worms about the current playoff format against perhaps the 1-8 format that so many of us, I think, probably prefer, what feels like the motivation for the Lightning right now in that, you know, 4 points back at Toronto. And again, yes, you can catch them for home ice in that series, but increasingly, what does home ice even mean in the NHL playoffs? Even if you have a great barn like the Lightning have, is that going to give you the kind of advantage that makes it necessary to really sell out and do all you have to do, give 110% every single shift down the stretch?
Nobody gets the Philly flu anymore. Right.
No.
There's no true home ice advantage. I mean, even the Lightning in 2015, when they went up against the Rangers in the Eastern Conference Final, Game 7 at Madison Square Garden, all the mystique. Henrik Lundqvist has never lost a Game 7 at home. The Rangers haven't lost a Game 7 on home ice in 40 years or whatever, and it didn't matter. Now, granted, you got Ben Bishop in goal at that time. You've got Andrei Vasilevsky in goal right now. Like, goalies are always the optimal equalizer in any of those situations, right? But I'm with you. I don't think home ice really factors into it. I think coaches will tell you they would prefer to have a Game 7 at home. But I think if you look historically at the numbers, it's about 50-50, right? And even thinking back to that 15 season for Tampa Bay, they set a franchise record with 32 home wins during the regular season. They were under 500 in the postseason, right? Like, go figure that out. Like, it's just there's no rhyme or reason to it. So, and being on home ice, you get to control the matchups, but that's it. That's the only advantage you have with home ice now. You don't even have the face-off advantage, right? They changed that to where whoever's back is closest to the goal has to put their stick down first. So, so there's honestly, to kind of make a long-winded answer to actually answer your question, there's nothing for them to play for. They're playing for themselves. You know, they're playing to fit Tanner Jeannot into the lineup right now, and we'll see what happens with this team before Friday's trade deadline if they do anything else. But that's it. So there is no incentive. There's no reason. You know, if you're on the ice and you're trying to decide, should I step in front of that 100-mile slap shot for a game that doesn't matter, or should I save that for the playoffs? What's your choice going to be? I'm probably going to sidestep that and maybe save that for the playoffs, because you don't want to put yourself in that situation. So it is difficult for the Lightning where they're at to match these teams that are trying to get into the playoffs and keep a position in the playoffs compared to what they're going through.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Tanner Jeannot, and I did not share my notes with Eric before we got started here, but that was going to be what I was going to ask you about next. Is, you know, I'll be honest, I kind of admire the forthwith nature of Patrice Brisebois the other day, and basically saying, like the LA Rams have said in the NFL, F them picks. You know, I'll give all the picks I have to give in order to get the guy that I want. And we wanted a guy like Jeannot. Some people would call him a middle six. Some people have called him bottom six. He certainly hasn't produced offensively this year the way he did last year. So that's a valuable question about whether last year was a fluke or not, and he can continue to provide that. But is there a feeling amongst Lightning fans that, hey, you know what? Brisebois just did what he had to do to get the right guy. Or is it, my gosh, what? We gave up 4 or 5 picks and a player for this guy. Are we trying to do too much?
It's a debate. There's no doubt because it's a lot of assets to give up for one player, and that one player is not Patrick Kane, right?
Right.
So that's what you're kind of placing the value on. But I think we have to kind of take a step back and look at it. Value is whatever the buyer wants to place on it, or what the seller wants to place on it, right? I've used this analogy. You walk down the street and you like your neighbor's car. Man, I'd like that car. How much you want for it? It's not for sale. But what if I give you this? Nah, I'm still not. I don't want to sell the car. Okay, how about if I go here? Eh, nah, I still don't want to sell it. So it gets into a negotiation factor, and it's all about value placed on it. So on the surface, it's an overpay. There's no way getting around that. You give up 6 assets for one player who's middle six guy, who's going to play in a third line role here in Tampa. He's not going to get any power play time. He'll get some penalty kill time eventually, but he plays a physical game. He's 4th in the league in hits. He's 3rd in hits amongst forwards. He's among the league leaders in fights the last couple of years, so he's willing to do that for his team. And the other thing that I think has to be factored in here is that this is not a rental player, and I would be shocked if before we get to July 1st and Tanner Jeannot becomes a restricted free agent, if there's not a long-term extension in his future. And we're talking 5-6 years, probably in a comfortable team range of $2 to $3 million, somewhere in there where they feel he's going to be a long-term solution because, Pat Maroon has that role right now. I don't know how much Pat Maroon has left in him. He's got one more year left on his deal. So Tanner Jeannot is a replacement for that kind of role as well. So it's not just a this year situation. And you do have to admire the way that Julien Brisebois factored it all out, right?
Right.
He said, and I love this quote, and then it gives you the true insight into his mentality. We know the actual value of those picks and the odds of them becoming NHL players 4 or 5 years down the road, but we also know the value of those players helping this group of players right now win a championship, and that's 0%.
Right.
So he's going for it, and he's proven the last couple of years that he is bold in his conviction. And they identify something, they identify the player that's going to fill that role, and they go out and they do it. Everybody said it was an overpay for Barclay Goodrow. It worked out pretty good.
It worked
right?
out, yeah.
It was an overpay for Brandon Hagel. So far, it's worked out pretty good for Brandon Hagel. So yeah, you are definitely sacrificing future, but you're trying to win now.
And you bring up sacrificing future. The Lightning now without a first-round pick in the next 3 drafts, down to just a 6th rounder and 2 7ths in this draft. Their first pick is in the 3rd next year, I believe. Yep. And you cited some of those names that people have talked about. Stamkos and Killorn are both 33. Belmar and Perry are both 37, right? Maroon, who you mentioned, is 34. On the blue line, you've got 34-year-old Ian Cole, 32-year-old Zach Bogosian, Hedman's 32 as well. So when do you think, and this is a question we're asking ourselves in Pittsburgh right now as well, when does the rebuild begin, and how much longer can you continue to sell the future for the now?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities between the Penguin situation and the Lightning with their core players. I think the one difference in Tampa Bay's factor here is part of their core also includes a Braden Point, who's 26 years old. Mm-hmm. Nikita Kucherov is 28, 29. Andre Vasilevsky is 29 years old. Mikhail Sergachev is 25 years old. So they've kind of got this secondary tier of core players who aren't in their 30s, right? So right. They're still on the incline of their peak, where some of these guys are on a decline a little bit. So I think as long as you have a Kucherov, a Point, specifically Vasilevsky, he's the X factor in everything that they've been able to do the last couple of years with the way he plays in goal. As long as you still have that group playing at their peak, I think you're going for it every year, as long as you're in a playoff position. At some point, do you wonder all the amount of hockey that they've played in 3 years and 3 straight cup finals? Does it kind of wear on them a little bit? There's no doubt at some point you get that. And there is a point of diminishing returns. I think they started to feel that a little bit in the first round against Toronto last year. And I think they had a team meeting after game 3, I think it was, say, no, this is not acceptable. This is not who we are. Are you going to let this window close because you're tired? No, let's go out and do it. And they fought their way back, and they found a way to win that series and get back to the cup final. And, if not for a too many men missed call in overtime or
Right.
an unhealthy Braden Point. I mean, who knows how things could have gone in that series, but they pushed themselves. They willed themselves back to the Stanley Cup final last year.
It's almost as if, if any of these aging teams, you think the Caps, you think the Bolts, you think the Pens, if any of them were able to squeeze one last cup out of this core that they have in place, they would feel like the 83 Islanders when they vanquished the Oilers. You hear that story all the time that Messier and Gretzky tell about losing to them in the Stanley Cup final, and they're walking past their locker room and they expect them to be jumping up and down and spraying champagne and beer everywhere. And instead they all just sat there slumped at their stalls like
with ice packs.
Yeah. A sigh of relief. Like, whew, we got there. We got to the finish line and we managed to pull it off again. And that's what it feels like. Like all of these teams are just looking to squeeze one more out of it. And if they can, it'll be more a sense of relief than a sense of joy.
And legacy. Like it
Yes.
adds to a legacy. I mean, look, the Penguins and the Lightning are the only teams in the past 30 years to win back-to-back titles. That's a legacy right there. If you can add another one, boy, it just adds to more of it, right? And I know the
Right.
Pens had the one back in 09, so they do have a little bit of that legacy with them on top of everything else they did in the Mario and Jágr years. But yeah, there's legacy involved here too. And players like legacy, right? They like the legacy. If you can be called a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, a 4-time Stanley Cup champion in today's age of parity, yeah, there's no doubt. So yeah, and again, going back to what Julian said after making the JEANNOT trade, that basically as the guardian of this group of players, he feels he owes it to them to give them every single opportunity to continue to win championships. Because here's the other thing. This franchise, think about how the stars have aligned to have a Stamkos, a Kucherov, a Point, a Hedman, a Vasilevsky, a Cirelli, a Sergachev, this group of players together at the same time. It's probably never going to happen in the history of the franchise to have this type of talented group of players together at the same time trying to win cups. And I think you factor all that in, and that's when you get an overpay for a Tanner Jeannot or an overpay for Brandon Hagel, because you're trying to build around the core with players you feel can fit in. I mean, Brandon Hagel has been a great fit with Nikita Kucherov and Braden Point on that top line, and he's played a ton of time on the top power play unit this year. There's no doubt that you're trying to keep that core together and build around it and give them players that can help them win another one or multiple ones.
Eric, great stuff. Loved catching up with you. For people that are looking to get the latest on what's going on with the Lightning ahead of this matchup between the Pens and the Bolts, lightninginsider.com, at Lightning Insider on Twitter as well to follow Eric. He's got everything up to the minute ready to go for what should be a fascinating final matchup between the Pens and the Lightning this season. Thanks again for making the time today, man. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And just to correct the Twitter handle, it's actually my name with an underscore between it.
Oh, my apologies.
That's okay. No,
Jeez,
it's not on the graphic here. It's not on the graphic. So
at Eric with a K _ Erlendsson, 2 S's on Twitter, and you will get everything up to date and up to the minute, on Twitter with what's going on with the Lightning. Thanks again, Eric. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, the similarities and the parallels between these two organizations, there's a lot of them there as both of them continue to get older. You just wonder if the Pens are handling the transition to a younger core as well as the Lightning seem to be handling the transition to a bit of a younger core. That transition continues through the trade deadline, Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. The way we will handle it here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff and 93.7 The Fan is we're going to be with you through the whole thing. So about 2:45 Eastern on Friday, I personally will jump on the Odyssey app. Yes, we will do a go live on the Odyssey app Friday afternoon, sort of reacting to the final few minutes of the trade deadline as it counts down to 3 p.m. Eastern. And then after the deadline, I will get some of my friends from 93.7 The Fan, Adam Crowley. We'll grab Jeff Hathorn. After Ron Hextall speaks, we'll get together and do a YouTube live version of our first YouTube live version of Fifth Avenue Faceoff. How about that? And also record it for a podcast to get up after that as well. Probably, I'm guessing, if Ron Hextall speaks between 3 and 4 Eastern on Friday, we'll get that up. We'll record it sometime between 4 and 5 and get it up for you, hopefully, by dinner time depending on when dinner is for you, on late Friday afternoon, early Friday evening, with the trade deadline being at 3 o'clock. You want all the instant reaction to what Ron Hextall may or may not do at this year's NHL trade deadline and how it affects the Pittsburgh Penguins down the stretch and into the future. We got you covered here at Odyssey 93.7 The Fan and right here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff.